All right. Yeah, well, thanks for joining as we start to think about what does this world look like now. My name is Pete Royce. I'm an ELCA pastor in Rochester, Minnesota, the other Rochester, and home of Mayo Clinic, where obviously this is all the news is anywhere, but especially here. Oh my goodness. Mayo's been ramping up for the last several weeks, opening up new floors, doing all kinds of things. So it's fascinating to watch. So like I said, I'm an ELCA pastor. Most recently, I served as the Norma Malfatti of the Southeastern Minnesota Synod. I was the assistant to the bishop and DEM of this synod. But now I am working full-time with GSB. GSB is a fundraising firm that works with congregations, synods, really all nonprofits, all sorts of nonprofits, many church-related, but not all. Helping nonprofits have capacity to do what they feel called to do. And so we're just kicking off, or about to kick off, a Stewardship for All Seasons process in upstate New York, where you are. And it's a process of really helping congregations really kind of walk through a couple of years of thinking through stewardship differently, of encouraging generosity in a different way. So, and this is what I do. I've done it part-time for a few years and full-time since our bishop retired last fall. But with that, so what we as a firm bring to the table, and what I bring is kind of, I think, we bring the best of nonprofit fundraising and then bring that into the church. And then interpret that for what does that mean in a church context. And that's really what I want to do today, is kind of think about that context a little bit and think about how these things work together. Because at the heart, we as churches are places where people gather. We get together on Sunday mornings. We worship together. And as we do that, we pass an offering plate together. And that's been our normal practice. And so while there's other ways that people give, there's automated giving. We'll talk about some other ways that people do that. At the heart, in many congregations, a significant amount of income comes from the offering plate. And so what does the world look like in a world where there is no offering plate being passed? How do we think about this? We'll get into some technical pieces of ways to do some of this after a bit. But for me, it also raises, and there's a theological piece behind this, because I think in many churches, in many places, the anxiety level is very high, understandably. The world as we knew it, like within the last week, got thrown on its head. I'm on the church council of the congregation I'm a part of here, and on Wednesday we voted that, yep, we're still going to have worship on Sunday because they said gatherings under 250 are fine. And with it, in a couple of days, that all ended. And we went all online, and then we quickly found out that this wasn't a one weekend thing or a 2 weekend thing. This might be a multi-month, many-month activity. So, especially for finance people in churches, the anxiety of how in the world are we going to pay for things it's scary, and I understand that. But as we go to Scripture, and a good place for us to be grounded. Every time one of God's servants shows up, one of God's messengers shows up and talk to somebody, the first words they pretty much always say is, "Do not be afraid." And they say, "Do not be afraid," because the people they're talking to are terrified. This isn't just some pithy, "Oh, don't be afraid, it's all good." They're coming and saying it because people are shaking in their boots. And what God's messengers come and say is, it's going to be okay. We proclaim a God who walks with us through all kinds of stuff. We proclaim a God of life and death. And so in this time, I think the church actually has a unique place at this time to proclaim some good news. Does that mean that we're just sticking our head in the sand and pretending everything is fine? No, we're not. We're being honest. And that's, I think, as Christians, we get to be honest. And we're not a people who say that people don't, that there is no death. We proclaim there is death and there is suffering, and we don't hide from that. But we also say that God is with us in the midst of that. And that's where I want to be thinking about in the midst of this challenge is, how is God with us in the midst of this? How is God walking with us, even in financial anxiety that individuals are having, but definitely congregations are having? To believe that God will not leave us and God will not abandon us. It sounds good, and some days it's harder to believe, but it's the God that is proclaimed to us through Scripture. And so we ground ourselves in that. So I think that's a basic understanding that's critical. But then to move on to what does this mean for congregations as we start thinking about how do we encourage people to keep being generous. So to do this, we're going to go to some of the foundations, kind of the building blocks of good development work, and whether we want to call that fundraising, stewardship, different names for the same thing. What we're doing is we're encouraging people to be generous, and the ways that we do that are through helping people to see the mission that our congregation is accomplishing. If you're a congregation that has some clear values or mission statement, this is the time to go back to those and ask the question, how do we be this church now? The congregation I'm a part of, welcoming is a big part of who we are. That's a huge piece. Well, and so we're asking the question, how do we welcome when there's no building to welcome people into? There's no service to welcome people into in the same way. But it's still a value. And so how do we do that? This is an important piece for every congregation. It is to figure out how to be the church that God has called you to be in this time. Nobody expects you to have it figured out. I mean, we're 3, 4, 5, 6 days into this. The church just changed within a week. We can't expect to have all the answers. But the other thing is we have a lot of freedom to experiment, to try things. And the more we're able to be who God calls us to be, the easier it is for us to tell those stories. Last weekend, it felt to me like it was a good Minnesota blizzard weekend. And I'm sure you have those in upstate New York. You get a big storm that comes on a weekend, you shut everything down. That's fine. We can do this. We're hardy. But everything stops. And then you pick it up again. Well, when we had that and we realized this is maybe going to go on for months, that changes the game. That changes it from, the church council that I'm on, the motion was made last week, or actually a few days ago. These days feel like weeks. The motion was made to cancel worship. And we realized that actually is not what we're doing. We are suspending face-to-face worship, but we are still a church that's working. We are still a church that's proclaiming our good news. We're still doing our thing. We're just doing it, trying to figure out how to do it in different ways. And I think it's critical that people see that the church is still being the church. That you're not just, shuttering everything and, we'll come back someday later, but you are primed to do work now. In a time of anxiety, when people are afraid, the church has something to say. And so this is a good time for that. So this is a time to be telling those stories, telling stories of what you're trying to do, of ways you're attempting to do things, and those are great. Even better are stories of people who have been impacted, people who are being touched by your ministry. I think of a congregation I met with yesterday, I believe it was. One of the things they're doing is they're actually having their younger members adopt older members, because older members are being told don't leave home right now. And so now they have people calling them every day, checking in on them, praying with them, asking, can I pick you up some groceries and leave them in your driveway? All these things where the church is being the church. And getting a story from someone who's receiving those calls and feeling the love and care of the church is a great way to say, this is how we're still being the church today. So I'm curious for your congregation. I've been asking this with every group I'm with. It's always interesting to hear people, what are you trying? Now that you're not gathering it face to face likely, and what kinds of things are you experimenting with, or have you tried, or are you considering in ways that are helping you still be the church?
Who from our group would like to go first?
You start. You're our council president, Mark. You go.
Well, Kristen and I co-presidents, so.
Yeah, so, Mark, maybe you can start, and then I'll add, and then Jim and Kim can add.
Sure. Okay. So, Pete, we had a kind of an emergency virtual council meeting this past Monday evening. I guess technically it wasn't a council meeting because Pastor Anita, our transition pastor, wasn't there, and because she already had a commitment. So the rest of us met in whatever you want to call it. We had one of those
Yeah.
over the phone using Zoom.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kristen, for arranging for that. We decided on a number of things. We spent the bulk of our time talking about virtual worship, and Jim and Kim, who lead worship and music for our congregation, and Jim, who was the council president during the last time we did not have a pastor. Our pastor left a month ago.
Okay.
And so we are operating without a full-time pastor. We had our meeting and we decided several things. We are going to have virtual worship.
Okay.
We talked about what that would include. Jim and Kim put together a template based on what we use when we take communion to our folks who are shut-ins and not available to come to church.
Mm-hmm.
And we are looking at that now. Jim and Kim can talk about that in some more detail. We've been looking at whether our resources would go to our congregants through snail mail or electronically, because we have an older congregation, many of whom are not tech savvy. So we're looking at providing those materials in both ways. We recruited 14 volunteers who would make phone calls to 8 members of the congregation, and I'm hoping and expecting by the end of the day, every member of our congregation would have received a phone call
Awesome.
from one of these 8 volunteers, letting them know, that we're going to be, do they want materials online? Do they want materials through the mail so they can be getting those things? We are asking about prayers they would like. We're telling them about when we're going to be starting the virtual service, which is going to be a week from Sunday. Posting other resources to our Zion website. We decided that, we made a decision that Zion would continue to pay all of our the people on our payroll, regardless of whether they are putting in the same number of hours that they typically would, if we were operating with services, because we know that for some folks, they're living paycheck to paycheck, and we wanted to make a statement about, we're going to see you through this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the stuff that comes to mind for me right off the bat. How about Kristen and Jim and Kim add all the things that I'm forgetting about?
Kristen?
Maybe I'll volley this to Jim and Kim, because I think you've been very thorough, Mark, and probably Jim and Kim have some extra details on worship.
Kristen, I just didn't call your name because I don't see you on the screen. I'm sorry about that.
There, Scott, I got it now.
Now we got it. Yeah, we have Kristen.
I'll see if I can get my video going. I didn't start it right away because the background was really not great. So
It's no problem. I went ahead and I typed in, asked for the names to be underneath the photos. Yours was a black box. Now we've got Kristen up there, so we're all set. Anyway, what I did, Mark, is I went back into what we always call the red hymnal. And I don't know, other churches, maybe they're on another hymnal now, whatever, but at any rate, and
the cranberry one, I guess.
beg your pardon? Cranberry.
The ELW, is that the one that you're talking about, the newest one?
Yeah. Anyway, there's a number of services that were listed in there. What had happened about 5 years ago when I was president is Pastor Anita Moore at Our Savior in Utica, just down the road from Zion Lutheran Church in New Hartford, had helped us with our home communion ministry when we were in between pastors. We had approximately a 10-minute recitational type of service along with a brief communion that we had provided. I had that in print, and I mentioned to the council that we had that. But then I remember Anita told me that in the cranberry colored hymnal, there were different formats. Well, I took the service of the word and modified it. What we did, and when Mark mentions about a template, what we did is I put it all in there from start to finish, minus some of the, forgive me if I'll call them the minor prayers that a minister might recite, but everything that people tended to recite congregationally, or those ministerial comments or statements that help cement this virtual liturgy together, I included. I put it in large enough point print, and also did it in bold print for people that may be challenged in terms of reading the print. And this template included everything except the readings, because they change week to week, the sermon, which changes week to week, the prayers of the congregation, which change week to week, and then we would have an addendum, which would be any announcements that should be included. Now, we could send them out in print form with by snail mail, but also put them on our website. So that's why we said we have a template, but then on a weekly basis would send out the other things that I just listed for you. We were going to employ our transitional pastor, Anita Moore, down the road, and then several supply pastors, plus our associate ministry, Patsy Glista, to help us with sermons or sermonettes, and even podcasts. In addition, for Easter Sunday, we've already commissioned Pastor Jennifer DeWorth to provide us with a Zoom broadcast of our Easter service. One of the challenges that we have is how we include music in with the weekly offering, if you will, to people, or the weekly supplemental bulletin. Now we could put music on the website. We could do it in podcast form, or a scaled down audio version, I suppose. I realize with the Zoom broadcast, we probably can include music that way, at least an excerpted version with individuals who are doing solos and maybe even our organist. And we also, as a supplement, copy versions of different hymns, relevant hymns from our hymnal, and then send them out. Since we've already purchased them, there's no copyright infringement by doing that. So at any rate, that's generally what it is we're trying to do. And what Mark had mentioned about contacting individuals, we don't intend this just to be a one-way deal when we phone people, but we want to gather information. Are you okay? Is there anything you need and whatnot, as well as giving them information about how we're going to maintain our spiritual connectedness through service. Finally, we hope that people will tune in, if you will, I'll put that in quotes, especially people that receive the information by snail mail, that if they set their alarms for 10 a.m., that everybody could be maybe sitting down and praying and using this service all at the same time. We got that idea from the 9 at 9 that you've got, Pastor Norma, which Kim and I have tuned into the last several days. And so having everybody doing the same thing at the same time, at least theoretically, could make for sending a powerful spiritual message. And finally, as far as making the phone contacts, we don't intend this to be a one-time only, one size fits only. We're giving people an outline to follow, those who are calling in, but we want to keep it simple and spiritual so that they can use their own pleasantness, their be themselves when they're on the phone, and not just be mechanical and listing, hi, how are you? It's nice to hear from you, type of thing. And it'll be done, we hope, on a weekly or a bi-weekly basis. So that's what we have in the hopper right now. Why we're all on this, we still haven't figured out the stewardship component.
Yeah.
Let me just add that I want to underscore what Jim just said. We've asked the volunteers who are calling their list to continue to do that on a weekly basis. And when they speak with each individual, we're encouraging them to encourage the folks they speak with to be reaching out to others in the congregation who they're close with, maybe people they sit with each week. They probably are already doing this, but we know that our Sunday service is meeting religious and spiritual needs, but it's social connection for a lot. And so we want to maintain that. We also want to, rather than people only being recipients, they can also be folks who are initiating. And so for them to take that same idea and to be calling other people in the congregation, and if that can just spread so that there's this net of people who are getting contacts from lots of different sources. So that's part of what we're looking to convey and asking people to do. And
okay.
So.
And I guess to add, I do think that there are some special challenges in being without a pastor at this time. So, I look at other congregations, and largely the pastoral staff is doing the legwork that Jim and Kim are doing right now in worship and music. And so I think that, we're responding the best we can. But I do think that there are some additional challenges that we have as a congregation, being without a full-time pastor right now.
So one of the so thank you. Oh my gosh, you guys are pretty amazing. You guys are, and when you're writing your MSP later on down the road, you should talk about like how leadership, right, is really ready to step up and lead in these times. I thought I'd also share just a couple of things that my congregation and congregations I work with are doing. We have, in addition to lots of different virtual worship offerings that are happening, on the south side of Syracuse, Appleseed Outreach, one of our new starts, their worship is dinner worship and among vulnerable people. And so what they've decided to do is on Wednesday nights, they're creating, they're still providing dinner, but it's to go, and people can come to the door and get their meal and go. Since most of the people that come to worship walk from the neighborhood, that's worked out pretty well. There's also congregations that are making sure that their food pantry is well stocked and making sure that there are people that are physically present
Hey,
for
Linda,
that.
I need to call you back. I'm on a phone meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to talk to you about Sarah.
Okay, bye.
And in addition, and I would love to get, if you could send me digitally, Jim, what you all are doing. We have a couple of congregations that are also creating worship care packets and sending people home with an ELW. Right, they're sitting in the sanctuary not being used, and so just hoping they come back at the end of all of this. But everyone's getting an ELW. Directions for how to follow a brief order of worship using the service of the word or using the daily prayer, creating a little resource on how to use the small catechism for reflection, since that's and prayer, since that's at the back of the ELW, as well as a card from members of the congregation and stuck in there just to be loving one another and to send people home with resources. So that, again, right, like you all are trying to do that, maybe every Sunday at 10 o'clock, everybody's doing this together, or maybe they're figuring out some new daily patterns. But again, it's right. It's about finding those ways to make connection, as well as the many phone trees that are happening, right? You've already figured this out. You're in pastoral transition, but it doesn't have to be the pastor being the one making all the calls.
The important thing to realize is, as in any ministry, you're not going to be doing everything the church down the street is doing, and that's okay. Be you and be the best of you. So if someone else, has all the technology and they can hit streaming worship out of the park and do it beautifully, that's great. If yours looks like someone holding an iPhone, is preaching the word, that's fine too. And be yourself. Don't get don't get anxious about what someone else is doing. learn from them, you know, if there's things that you can pick up. But this is where, you know, in the fundraising world, we talk about going back to your core values, and the congregations that are clear about who they are, it's easier at times like this to figure out what should we be doing, because what they should be doing fits with who you are. And, you know, it helps to answer those questions that are critical. But all of this, so talking about ministry is actually the important part of encouraging people to be generous, helping people to know what you're doing. Because the tendency is to say, you know, we're way behind on our budget, you know, and talk about, you know, budgets and spreadsheets and giving charts. And frankly, those do not motivate people. You know, people want their giving to go to ministry, not to keep some organization from dying. They want it to be positive. So keep the message as positive as possible. Tell the outcomes of what's happening. Like I said, make sure people know you're still doing ministry, and the ministry that you're doing. Because like I said, I think the church is uniquely situated for a time like this to do great work, and make an impact. So let's be the best of who we are, share that story, touch lives, and then share that. And as I said, keep positive. Keep the message as positive as possible. And there are situations that come when a congregation can't pay its bills. If that happens, then you need to be clear about that. We don't hide it. We need to be clear about that and have a special appeal to try to catch up. And there's some ways that we can do that. But in my experience, churches hit the panic button way too early. Where, you know, I've known churches that are $5,000 or $10,000 behind on their giving. They have $100,000 or $150,000 in reserves, but they're like, but we can't keep this up. Well, that's true, you can't keep this up, but panicking too early, what all that tells the people in your congregation is that you have a hard time managing money. We need to be able to portray that we are doing ministry with what's happening. So keeping that in mind is important. And for those who get excited that we're burning into our reserves, and if you have a rainy day fund, it's raining. This is when it's for. So don't get anxious about that. Like I said, unless you have to, but most of the time we don't. So keep the message as possible and exciting, because people, you know, that's one of the axioms. You know, the people give when there's something positive to give to. There's some research done after the 2008 financial crisis, and what they found was people remained generous. I mean, some of the amounts went down slightly because income went down slightly, but the percentages remained the same. But people became more selective. They gave to the organizations that they felt were making a difference in that time. And so help people to see how your congregation is making a difference, how you're still relevant, because you are. So make sure that that's a piece of your conversation as you do that. So as we tell those stories, so another piece is after we inspire people about what we're doing, we need to be able to ask. We can't just assume the offering plate is going by and so people are going to put something in it. We have to be able to boldly say, this is ministry we're doing. We invite you to help support it. Research has shown time and time again, the largest reason people don't give to an organization is nobody asked. And sometimes we think if we ask everybody, that works, but I always say if we ask everybody, we're not really asking anybody, because it's easy to say, well, yeah, they really mean him. They don't mean me. One thing that we as a firm strongly recommend in this time is that a pastor or a pastoral leader, so it could be your interim, has a conversation with the top 10% of those giving. Not to just give them special treatment, but in most congregations, those at the top give a significant proportion, you know, between 40 and 60% of the annual giving. So sharing with them what the congregation is doing, making sure they are aware that ministry is still boldly moving forward, can be an important way to solidify kind of how things are going and to relieve some anxiety. So that's just one thing that we recommend, understanding that in some contexts, you know, that may be a bridge too far, you know, that's not in the culture, and I get that, but just so you know, that's something that we strongly recommend. Another thing to be aware of is what percentage of your income comes from any sort of automated giving, because automated giving at this time, unless someone makes a specific change, will continue to come in whether you're in worship or not. And so, so churches that have a larger percentage of automated giving can feel a little more comfortable because they have that base to go back to. So that can be for your church leadership a way to kind of relieve some of the anxiety to say, I know we're not passing a plate, but 60% of our income comes in this way. It looks like it's still going to keep coming in. This is also a great time to encourage people to get on automated giving. Often there's a certain number of people who are interested in it, but just never get around to it. This is a time to help people get around to it. And the messaging behind this is, it's not to say, your church really needs your money. Can you get on automated giving to help us? The message is actually what's in this for the donor. And what's in it for, so what you do is you find someone who's already on some sort of automated giving and have them tell the story of how easy it is and how this helps them to support their ministry, whether they're on vacation or out of town or whether there's no worship. And we can tie it in, no face-to-face worship. We can tie it in to the current situation. Have them tell that story of why they do it. There's no more powerful way to encourage people to do things than for someone to say, I'm doing this, join me. Much better than, this is really important, you should do it. But if someone's already doing it, they're listened to in a different way. So it's a strong way that we recommend doing that. This also could be a time to talk with one of your more generous donors to provide a challenge. To say, for every family that signs up for automated giving in the next month, they will give $50. Or I have another church where someone is going to give a $5,000 gift if a certain, we're going to come up with that number if a certain number of people, sign up. Help the donor to have a reason to do it. It is good for the church, but help them to see how it's good for them too. And so that's one piece that, helping people into automated giving is an important way, or can be an important way. And automated giving, can come through, either Vanco or Tithely or whatever processor you use, or individuals in the congregation can even set it up with a bill pay at their local bank, so that there's some sort of regular giving that happens, so that check comes on a regular basis. So that's one way to kind of think about it. But the other, so outside of automated giving, how do we encourage people to actually give? One option people still should have is they can mail checks. We're going to talk about online giving and ways to do that. And I think that's a critical piece of the puzzle right now. But there is a certain percentage of people who, it doesn't matter how much you talk about it, they will not give their credit card or bank information to anybody. I think of my father-in-law. There's no way he's doing anything other than writing a check. Not going to happen. And so, so make sure that the people know that's an option. But with that in mind, be thinking with your leadership of your congregation, how does that work? Because your normal processes for receiving checks of having your counters after worship doesn't work because you're not having people there after worship. So think about who's going to receive the checks. In many places, the whole campus of the congregation is closed. Who gets the mail? Who's getting these collated? Know that. Think about that. Think about who's doing the counting. We still like to have good financial processes with multiple people doing the counting together. But how does that work? One of the churches I talked to a couple days ago, they have 2 counters in their congregation, both 80-year-old women. They don't want either of those women coming and touching all these checks. So they're having to rethink, how are we going to do this? How does it then get inputted into your giving software so that you can track these gifts? I don't come with the answers because I don't know, every congregation has to think about this, but be aware that there's an issue that you need to be thinking about how this is going to happen, because what we don't want is for people to be mailing in checks, assuming they're going to support their church, and they sit in a post office box somewhere because no one's set up to pick it up. Again, just one of those under the radar things that we have processes and we've assumed it's worked, but right now may not work anymore. So be thinking about some helpful ways. Make sure people know your address, all those things, and make sure that they know that their check is still good, and that will still support the ministry. But on top of that, we do want to have online giving options. So I know we have some other people on the call now. How many of you have an easy way to give through your website where people can go to your website and give directly to your congregation? Is that something, just wave your hand, is that something you have or do not? You guys have it? If you don't, well, so if you do, make sure that it's easy to find on your front page. I've been to some congregations where there is an option to give, but boy, you have to work pretty hard to find it. And that's not as helpful. If you don't have that option at this point, and this is a time to start looking into how do we do this, just because we want to make it as easy as possible for people to give. For those on the call, do you know who you use as a processor for that kind of thing, and whether that be a Vanco or Tithely or PayPal or
Tithely.
Tithely? Okay.
One issue has to do with the fact that there's a surcharge.
Yep.
But calculating it out, to me, it's not dissimilar from, really, when people use checks, it's costing them 25 to 50 cents or sometimes more per check. So if they're concerned about the expense there, they're not taking into account that they bought all these checks in the first place.
Yeah.
But some people have brought up the issue of, well, gee, I want to give $10 to the church, but then, they said that they take so much money out of it. We said, well, there's two ways of doing it. One is give the 10, but give 10 plus whatever the surcharge is on top of it. And that's hard for people to wrap their hearts around, I guess you say.
Yeah.
Jim, actually, I learned this in council that surcharge was coming, and based on Mark's suggestion, set up something with my bank. So the bank automatically sends, so this was, I guess, of my own initiative, but the bank automatically sends the check to Zion, and then, then the surcharge doesn't come out because it's going through my bank, and that's a free service that my bank provides for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe as we're thinking about this, we could send out several options. And I think the Tithely option, we don't have to say, oh, there's this surcharge, worry about the surcharge.
Mm-hmm.
I think the more important thing is that people are having an opportunity to continue giving.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's at the heart of it. And there used to be a lot more restaurants that wouldn't take credit cards. It was cash and check only. And I don't see that hardly anymore, very much anymore, because that's not the society for in many places, that's not the society we live in. That's, just kind of for them built into the cost of doing business. And the way we talk about this and encouraging generosity is, some people get very anxious about, well, we don't want any money to go to a credit card processor. And I understand that, people want their money to go to ministry, but it's the difference of, would I rather have someone give a $100 gift and receive $97 of it, or have them not make the gift? Personally, I'd rather have the $97. And that's it. If we don't provide that opportunity, there are gifts that we will not receive. And so having that option for people, I think, is important. And making it as easy and accessible for people as possible is important. Another piece that can go along with that many of the the Vanco and Tithely and many other processors use is an option to text to give. I've known a lot of churches that have set this up over the years. I've only known a few that actually had people utilize it. The way that process works is you're assigned a phone number. So people, say text, to this number. So like the congregation I go to is called People of Hope, and we do this. So if I go to, they give me the number to text to, so I text to the number, and if I just type People of Hope 50, that means $50 will go to People of Hope. And so I do that, but then I immediately get a text back from that processor saying, and give me your bank information or credit card information, whatever it is, and then it's processed that way. Some people, I think, have wondered, how does this mystery work of, I send a text and suddenly somebody gets money. There is an extra step in there where the financial transaction is set up. But I believe in many cases, once that's set up, you don't have to reset it up every time. They recognize your phone number, and that can go. Where that gets easiest is especially if you're doing an online worship or something like that. If people have a smartphone near them, that's a very fast and easy way. They don't have to find your website. They don't have to log in. They just, boom, can do it, and it happens. Like I said, Tithely has it. I know Vanco has it. Other processors have it. It's just something that, something you have to set up. But it's, again, it's just another way. We're trying to give people many options of ways that they can support your church. And remember, so even as we worship, excuse me, we take time to, usually we take time to have an offering. We can take time to encourage people to give. And remember, as we do that, we're telling the story of the ministry. They're not just giving to an institution. They're giving to somewhere that's doing God's work. So help them to see what God's work is in the midst of all that. And so there's some technical pieces that we can do to make it as easy as possible for people to give. But the messaging behind it really is critical. And the messaging is, look what God is doing here. Look at the ministry that we're doing. Look at the lives that are being touched. Let's hear stories of how that's happening. And with that, people will say, St. Mark's by the gas station, they're doing great work. I want to see their ministry. I want to see more of that happening. I mean, churches that are doing feeding ministries, and this is a great time to say, look what we're doing together. We're caring for God's people. Help us to make that possible. Don't be afraid to ask. Don't be ashamed of that. But the way we talk about it is, we talk very bluntly about money, but money is always in the context of ministry. It's never money for the sake of a budget. It's never money to help us break even or even to pay staff. It's money to allow us to do what God calls us to do. And even the staff that you have, wherever they may be working, are still a part of helping your church do what God calls you to do. So that's kind of the big picture, and realizing that God has this under control, and then helping to tell our stories as a way of inspiring and encouraging, and helping to be on board with that. Any thoughts or wonderings or questions that you might have, kind of as we kind of wrap up our time here?
One of the things that I had read in a time where they say approximately half or more of the individuals out there are living paycheck to paycheck,
mm-hmm.
having an online version, especially one that can be applied through the smartphone, enables people to spontaneously give.
Yeah.
So if somebody's just checked their bank account and sees that they've got a little extra money in there, perhaps they've seen something that the church has done online or whatever, and then they decide at that moment to transfer funds from their financial institution to the church. So what you're saying in terms of 21st century technology actually can tap into maybe an underutilized resource.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
One of the pastors in our synod, they have a food pantry at their church, and a social worker, he just posted this on Facebook, and a social worker just stopped by to get food for the person's client, and then also gave the pastor money to say thanks for being here, mm-hmm. and here's a little something to help you keep doing it, because I'm sure offerings are down.
Yeah.
So you never know, right? The impact when you're connected and embedded in your community.
Yeah.
You don't know the people that you're touching because they might not be at church, but in times like this, they notice and they see when we're being the body of Christ.
And another piece I'd forgotten to mention, and people in your congregations are at very different places right now. Your congregations have people who are out of work suddenly. Maybe they work in the hospitality industry.
I got to watch this.
So there's a lot of anxiety about, what does this mean? And how are we going to survive? And we understand that, and we need to be sensitive to that. But we also have people in your congregations who are either retired on set incomes, or they're in an employment that is fairly stable. And I know you have people who are they're stably employed, working from home, and actually aren't out and about doing the things that they normally do. So for them, they may actually have a greater capacity to give than they would otherwise. So this is why asking is important. We don't ask, in a way of twisting people's arms and say you need to give, but it's sharing the ministry and saying, help us to make, your gifts make this possible, and helping them connect those dots, so that So we're not afraid to ask at a time. We're sensitive, but I think too often we give the out of, well, I know it's really hard for everyone, so you probably can't give, but. Well, then we've already set the tone of, yeah, you don't really need to do this. If you feel that God has called you to do the ministry that you're doing, don't be afraid to ask for it. Don't be afraid to say, this is what we're doing together, knowing that some people can and some people can't support it right now, but that's okay. Even those who can't support it will be glad that there are people out there who can. But they'll be excited to see the ministry happen. See, if you just ask for dollars, people will feel ashamed they can't give the dollars. But if you're talking about ministry, they can participate in that ministry in some way also. So to keep that in mind. Other thoughts, wonderings, questions? Like I said, we're not going to figure this all out in a week. But it sounds like we don't have to, because we have some weeks to figure this out. And this will be a constantly evolving thing, so keep in conversation. Let's keep thinking about how to tell your story, and to inspire people to do the work, to be a part of the work you're doing. So,
Peter, if we wish to communicate with you in the future, if we have a particular question, whatever, may we do it through Pastor Norma?
Sure. Yep. And there should be, I think, Norma, was that part of the email? There was a kind of a one-page document I put together that you can give to your congregational leaders, that your leadership group, and a lot of these same themes are in there. But it's kind of in a nice one pager so that people kind of have something a little more tangible to look at too. So, and my contact information is on that as well. So,
if the attachment fell off the email, Jim, I can send that to you.
Okay.
The one that came from Patsy.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I just want to say, before we close, I just want to say how incredibly inspired and hopeful I am. The way that I have seen the church being the church over these last several weeks. Specifically, just hearing your plans today, folks from Zion. Reminded why you're such an awesome congregation, the ways in which you're stepping up, the ways in which you're acting justly for your staff. So thank you for that. Thanks for your leadership. And it's not just you, right? All the people who are going to watch this later. My Facebook feed is just full of things that are giving me hope as people are witnessing and being the church in this new, adaptive, uncertain, we're flying by the seat of our pants kind of way. But faithfulness is everywhere. And you really be in the church. And so thanks for that. And thanks for your ministries and all the ways in which you're learning how to do things in a new way.
Thank you, Norma.
You're welcome. Welcome.
Yeah, it's a crazy time, but God's here, so we'll keep figuring it out. Hey, thanks for your time today. Thanks for being a part of this, and we look forward to seeing what God's up to.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pete.
Come on.